Yeah, no, it's very nice to see our friends from all over the world, and I'm very happy that I'm able to talk to you here, sitting in sunny, summery South Africa rather than cold Washington at the moment, and still join this. The talk that I will give you now will actually shift gears a little bit towards paratransit, which is informal public transport that we see in throughout the developing world. And I'm going to just share with you some work that we've been doing around the use of priority infrastructure for hybrid paratransit services in the context of formal services like BRT that also exist. So I want to just acknowledge some collaborators that have been working on the work that I'm going to be presenting here. So the story of BRT in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have seven operational BRT systems around the subcontinent with varying standards, and there are quite a number of questions that are being asked about what the appropriate standards should be for BRT in the African context. And this is especially so in South Africa, where I think there's a certain amount of skepticism towards BRT that has taken hold. Our systems are underperforming, and in several ways. And I think we've learned that one of the key issues with BRT's success in Africa, and it mirrors the experience in the rest of the world, is how we deal with the informal operators is extremely important. And I think we've not sort of hit the right way of doing that. There probably isn't just one way of doing that. Now, in our context, these are minibus taxi operators. So government is typically not able to make large-scale formalization of these informal operators happen. Government doesn't have the money for that. Typically, also that government doesn't have the cooperation of the industry to actually make that happen, and that has led to some negative things like loss of livelihoods and a loss of passenger accessibility when services are suppressed or stopped or replaced by BRT sometimes. So there's been quite a few examples here where the informal operators, the minibus taxis, continue to operate in parallel to the BRT, and where their network and their services are really not integrated with the formal BRT and rail services at all. And there have been various efforts to upgrade these vehicles and the drivers and so on, kind of an incremental method. But the question that we wanted to look at over the last few years is to turn the attention a bit more to the infrastructure side, and to ask if we can use infrastructure-based approaches to leverage sustainable innovation in the paratransit sector. Understanding that making formalization happen on a large scale in the informal industry is a very difficult thing to do. It's very risky. It's probably more expensive than we can afford, and it hasn't really worked. Whereas something like providing infrastructure, providing lanes and integrated interchanges and things like that, that's something that we can do. That's something that our municipalities, our public agencies and so on can deliver. And so the question is, how can we sort of use that ability to make some positive change here? So we're talking really about hybrid operations, and that means we acknowledge that these informal services will coexist with the formal BRTs that we might be implementing. And just to think about what kind of hybrid operations we're talking about, one can think about sort of two axes. One which describes the amount of overlap between the BRT routes and the paratransit routes, and that might range from 100% overlap, where there's really a competitive or a parallel service operated by the paratransit operators in the roadway right next to the BRT trunk, which is the red line here. That might be a part of the route, and there might be zero overlap between the two, depending on the route net, what the route network looks like. If one looks at and the other dimension here, which is the amount of infrastructure that actually can be shared, you open up a whole bunch of other possibilities where we can start sharing. One can think about sharing the same lanes or the same interchanges between the formal and the informal systems. So again, at the top here, one could potentially have a BRT vehicle and a paratransit vehicle sharing the same lanes or the same set of lane infrastructure, or right at the bottom here where we have routes that are not overlapping but that cross at key points, and we have integrated transfer stations that can accommodate both. Now the bottom here, that's really the kind of picture that we see with our conventional trunk and feeder approach, where there's been a lot of models where the paratransit services are supposed to provide feeder services to the BRT trunk and then integrate at certain places for passengers to transfer. So as we move towards the right and the up in this graph, we move towards more competition between the two types of services. And that can be a bad thing, but the question is actually that's raised is also, are there not cases that we can make to allow some sharing of infrastructure in a more complementary kind of way, where the two services can actually help each other? And understanding that the difficulty is that governments in sub-Saharan Africa, at least, typically have very little control over the informal services, and we typically can't just legislate what they should be doing. So we embarked on a few simulation experiments to see how we can approach this problem. And I'm going to just quickly talk about three of these simulation experiments that we did. The first one was to look at priority infrastructure for paratransit vehicles only. So that's when there is no route overlap and we're only looking to provide some priority for the taxis on their own routes and their own corridors. The second example would be an example of shared lanes or hybrid lanes, where the question is whether we can use our existing BRT lanes and maybe repurpose them or design them from scratch rather as a multi-purpose, multi-class public transport lane that can accommodate different types of vehicles all on the same lane. And we did a micro simulation study there of an existing BRT corridor in South Africa. The third one was the one around market behavior, and that acknowledges that the paratransit operators typically have the freedom to choose and to adapt to whatever we put in place. And so the question is, how can we expect these informal operators to adapt their services in response to various shared infrastructure kinds of scenarios? So just kind of briefly zooming into each of these. So firstly, on the paratransit only priority lanes, we did some observational studies using drones to see what paratransit vehicles were doing. And I don't think you're going to be seeing this very well on these pictures, but essentially what happens a lot is that the drivers of these small paratransit vehicles use, when they encounter a significant congestion, they use things like turning lanes and even shoulders illegally to bypass some part or all of the queues, and then push their way back into the through lane and to get to this intersection. And this does save them quite a bit of time, but of course it's kind of dangerous and illegal because they're not using the lanes as they are supposed to be used. And so the question is, is it not possible to formalize and provide infrastructure to to formally allow this kind of benefit to the paratransit operator. We developed a macroscopic model of intersection operations, looking at various strategies. So the base case was just a regular shared street pattern at an intersection with curbside stops. We looked at alternatives such as a single lane pre-signal strategy, where queuing taxis can actually use the oncoming traffic lane opposite direction for some part of the cycle to skip the queue. There's also a queue jumping lane alternative that we looked at, where minibus taxis have use of their own lane for some part of the traffic signal cycle and get a short phase to disperse before the other vehicles get a chance. And then also a continuous taxi lane, which adds a whole extra lane for them. And we looked at the costs and the benefits for these strategies to the taxis, as well as to other vehicles, car road users, as well as the agency, across a range of different flow rates. I'm not going to show all the results, but just very briefly, there is, of course, the possibility for quite substantial savings in social costs, in net social costs across all of these different players. So where the taxi vehicles would benefit significantly from delay, which also means the taxi passengers, the public transport passengers, and then that would produce also a benefit to the operators themselves, which would be able to save on fuel and vehicle productivity and so on. In some cases, up to 40% savings for these operators. So that really speaks to the benefits that such as an option might have, and to public transport. And this, in many cases, in the cases that we looked at, without necessarily having big additional costs on drivers and car users. And of the different strategies we looked at, queue jumping lanes seem to be most preferable because they are least costly, but they provide quite significant benefits without having to provide whole dedicated taxi lanes along the whole corridor. Moving to hybrid or shared infrastructure, there's been some political pressure actually in South Africa for allowing minibus taxis to actually use existing BRT lanes, especially where these BRT lanes are seen as hugely underutilized when there's low frequencies of BRT buses. So the question is really, can that happen? And is there some case to be made for some shared public transport lanes that can accommodate both? We looked at this question by looking at a BRT trunk route in Tshwane. We're using a microsimulation model. And this is a trunk route which is near the CBD, but has a relatively low frequency of about 14 buses per hour. So it's really underutilized in terms of the bus lane capacity. And without, you won't be able to see the detailed results here, except to see that there are quite significant changes once we start allowing the taxis to go into the bus lanes for this case. For these quite congested conditions, allowing the taxis into the bus lanes does deliver quite substantial benefits. With very few downsides. The taxi passengers benefit again. Car users in the remaining lanes benefit because of the removal of the taxis from those lanes, and the bus delays don't really change much at all because there's all this extra capacity in the bus lane. These kind of benefits, of course, would be eroded for more busy corridors. So this is particular to this kind of low volume kind of corridor, where one can ask whether BRT lanes should have been implemented there in the first instance. Now, just in general, there are, of course, many factors that would affect the safety and the efficiency of such shared lanes, including the presence of bypass lanes and taxi stopping patterns and network effects and so on. So it warrants a lot of further investigation, but there is an indication here, at least, that shared lanes might help to reduce the political risk associated with implementing BRT trunks when there's really relatively low demand, and move forward on that. Then the third study, looking at the market behavior and adaptation of paratransit operators. So we used an agent-based approach here, which using a Maxim paratransit module, and we modeled essentially a BRT corridor along the sort of the center of this little picture here, surrounded by a network of streets, and paratransit operators are allowed to choose their routes and their frequencies and their fleet sizes and so on in response to the travel conditions along the corridor. Now, along the corridor, the BRT route is run as a fixed service with a certain headway. And we did find, just by setting up this model, that the paratransit operators, the drivers, are modeled to respond to our rules about whether taxis are allowed in a bus lane or taxis are allowed in parallel routes and so forth. So it's sort of a model that's working at this point. We are only looking at preliminary results yet, but I aim to take this further to look at more specific outcomes in terms of passenger access and travel time and so forth as a result of this adaptation of the taxi routes in response to the BRT service and in response to the rules of sharing of the BRT lane. We also, found that the paratransit vehicles do respond quite significantly to changes in the headway of the BRT. So they are able to capitalize quite significantly on longer headways by providing more frequent services along the corridor or in parallel to the corridor. Right, so just then conclusions at the end. I think overall there's a sense that there's definitely some argument to be made that we should be looking at infrastructure for paratransit and not just looking at trying to improve paratransit driver conditions and vehicle quality and so forth. And by doing this, we might be able to deliver faster and bigger benefits than by taking the more difficult and risky route of industry transformation alone. We should probably be trying to do both, but pay much more attention to these kind of infrastructure approaches. There's some ongoing research around how to take this forward in a network context. We're looking at the optimal location for these priority treatments in real-world networks. We're still looking at open and closed route approaches in Johannesburg. We're looking at some design features and design criteria for queue jumping lanes at intersections meant for taxi use, and then taking the network evolution work with the agent-based model further to understand those kind of options better as well. Thank you. Any questions? I would be happy to take.
Thank you, Christo. Very interesting. I think Corinne is waiting, but let me go first, and I'm going to take my advantage of having the mic first. So I wonder when you talk about allowing paratransit to use the infrastructure dedicated for BRT, if there's going to be a problem with the stops. And many of these BRT systems have high floors, and then the stops are not well designed for the operation of the paratransit. And that's one. And the second is related with how to divide the lanes of the road between the different modes. And because it seems to me that what you're looking at here is to have some form of high occupancy lanes, because when the paratransit is going to be one type of vehicle that have many passengers on board, and if you allow a certain number of lanes for that type of vehicles, then the paratransit will get the benefits. And I wonder if you can somehow, or how easy would be to have an argument in the lines of we should give lanes to the more efficient vehicles, and since paratransit are moving much more passengers, or if you have a threshold of so many passengers in a vehicle, you are allowed to use this type of infrastructure. So two questions in one, please.
Okay. Right. Yeah, I think the question of I'm actually not in favor of simply saying taxis should be able to use BRT lanes, because these BRT lanes and the infrastructure is definitely designed for a very particular kind of purpose, and one would have to look very carefully at issues of compatibility of the infrastructure, including passenger loading and alighting kind of facilities, and safety of those kind of things for passengers. So I think there might be cases where some sort of retrofitting might be possible, but I think one should think about that very carefully to make sure that you don't end up with something that's really degrading the service for passengers. I think what this is pointing towards for me is rather that we should be more careful in implementing BRT, full-scale BRT systems in places where we don't really have the demand for it yet, and that we should rather think about more incremental kind of approaches where we do have some sort of a hybrid system to start off with, which might be a high occupancy kind of lane with shared vehicles, and that might migrate over time to a more dedicated, a more high capacity bus only kind of system as it matures and grows, as the demand grows, and as we can learn from that. Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways what I'm saying here is not new, because simply like you say, the concept of allocating road space to the most efficient vehicle, which is a very solid concept, to us, public transport supporters, that's really what we're talking about here, right? And just figuring out how to do that correctly. But I think one of the key things is how to get that across in the context of a mode which is really kind of ignored and not even seen as a worthy public transport mode in a lot of the developing world, and where the knee-jerk reaction has been get rid of them. I think what we're talking about here is rather the thought of saying, no, the informal modes, they are not just a nuisance, but they certainly require or deserve better recognition, and also better treatment and better facilities on the public transport, on the infrastructure side.
I'm Sam Zimmerman, and I've done some work in South Africa, been there and observed. And first of all, the reason for the high platform stations ostensibly was to keep the informal sector out of them to start with. But that having been said, if you have a service pattern for the informal sector where they're leaving and coming on to the, let's call it an HOV facility, they don't need to use the stations. The stations are there with the presumption that people are transferring or walking on. And if you're doing the right thing with the hybrid service pattern, maybe they don't need to use the stations to start with, number one. Number two, if you allow a hybrid operation on the lanes, let's say, are you, for shared ride, for taxis, minibus taxis, are you concerned that ultimately they'll be totally open for all traffic, not just for the shared ride taxis? And then I have a third question. I should probably wait, but the third question is, my observation in South Africa, particularly Tshwane and other, and even in Joburg, is that you already have competition in the same corridor between the BRT services and the taxis. the taxis have not totally left. Maybe under the fantasies of the Department of Transport, they're not supposed to be there, but they are there. And to what degree have you all surveyed those that are currently using the taxis in the same corridors where the BRT operates for trips that could use either one, to see why it is that they're still in the taxis compared to using the BRT services? What are the differences among users? What's their perception of the attributes of the two types of services? Because I think that would tell you a lot about how to plan for this hybrid use.
Right. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think the first couple of questions are actually observations, and I think you are correct. The initial intention with the BRT design and the use of high corridors was that it should be keeping the minibus taxis out, and that's well, that was one of the reasons. I think that was under the assumption that we would be having much higher bus frequencies on some of these corridors than we actually have. And of course, that's due to a number of different factors. I'm probably talking more about Tshwane now than Johannesburg, but the fact that the network hasn't been expanding, we haven't been getting more and more passengers. There's been a real slowdown in rollout and so on, which really means that that the infrastructure that has been built has not been used very effectively at all, and that's creating further negative, I think, further resistance to rolling out the system further, both politically and in the public. So I think the question that is raised is simply whether we should be persisting with this kind of approach of assuming that we can get rid of the taxis and replace them with a BRT system, which then doesn't actually materialize to the extent that we needed to be to make the investment worthwhile in the first instance, or whether we should not be planning for a more hybrid thing from the start, which can maybe develop into a higher capacity BRT system over time. And these are all very context specific kinds of questions, which I think one should be thinking about, looking at all the factors involved. Around the question of user perception, we have looked at people's choice of mode between taxi and BRT on corridors where they both operate, especially in Johannesburg. There's definitely there is an appreciation for some of the service quality aspects that the BRT has. I think one of the main reasons why people still prefer the taxis is because of their short headways. So the shorter waiting times and the fact that people can catch a taxi closer to their origin and their destination with shorter walking times. I think those are some of the main reasons why taxis also remain competitive. So that really speaks to network integration. It speaks to first and last mile kind of services, first and last mile access to the BRT, which is probably not as good as it should be, and it also speaks to, of course, spatial patterns where we don't have the kind of densities around the BRT corridors to make for a lot of people that have short walking distances. So I think it's sort of a whole network problem for the BRT, not just a question of service quality of the buses.
Very good, thank you. Do we have your email, Ricardo?
Yeah, Christo is there. Christo.
No, but
on the screen.
Yes, okay, sorry.
Yeah, then I can give it to you, no problem. We have to leave the room in 5 minutes, so only very short comments are allowed. Sorry about that. Corinne, do you want to say something? You were ahead and then I'm going
No, I've sent Christo a message through the chat, so that's fine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Corinne. Jose?
Yes, thank you for the presentations. I have a question for Corinne and for Christo. I was wondering if it's possible that paratransit could be incorporated into a mobility as a service bundle, and if that could work. Thanks.
Do you want to go first, Christo? Perhaps I'll go first, as I talked about mass.
Yeah, why don't you go first? Yeah.
Typically, yes, of course, it can be part of the mass ecosystem, but it would exaggerate the issue of how you allocate revenues from what the user pays to the operators, because paying informal operators is clearly going to be more difficult because they would have to become more formalized to be part of the ecosystem. I think that's the short answer, given the time.
Thank you, Corinne. Juan Carlos?
Very briefly, I was interested by Christo's point of, even though we don't like paratransits to enter BRT lines, maybe there are specific segments in which that would make benefit for all and don't really hurt the BRT that much. And I think for those cases, something that we should remember is that the GOG, the distance between the wheels of the bus, is much wider than of a taxi. So maybe we could take advantage of that and make the entrance and the exit easier to enforce in those specific places, so that only the buses can go ahead and the taxis are forced to go out just because of the infrastructure. Thank you.
We're open to any comments to close the session, and thank you everyone for participating. Well, thank you, Christo, and hope we have more meetings in when we go back to the summer. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and I would like to thank again all the speakers for sharing their research and putting more questions to us. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao,
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Christo. Bye, Corinne. Bye, everyone. Ciao.
Christo, if you don't get the message, let me know and I'll send it again.
Let me just see here.
This is Zegras. Just left.
Corinne, I got it. Thank you.
That's
You can
okay.
check.
Let me know if you want any of the literature.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll do that by email. Thanks.
Yes, of
Bye,
course.
everybody.
Catch up soon.
Okay.
Thank you, Ricardo, for organizing it.